Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. These kids don't know where I'm coming from, where I've been or what track I'm running on. So I'm taking them back to the days before the pain, before the hate, before the sadness or the rage, before there was an empty space, before there was a GMH. There was a boy who loved this place, but then he turned one, he turned to his mum, but she wasn't there, she was popping out another one. He turned to his dad, he was getting mad, drinking every night with his pals in the flat. Time soon flew, he turned two, clearly neglected, clearly abused. He couldn't see straight, he couldn't move, he'd been abandoned like old news. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. He was left with his dad when his mum found another man. Dad couldn't cope, so his nan had other plans. Went to live with his nan and granddad. They took care like parents should have. They should have kept him, he should have stayed there. He needed protecting, they knew he was safe there. Daddy returned with a new bird, caused a stir, they moved in with her. The mental and physical soon became blurred. She was a witch, she put power in words. Physically tortured when dad was at work, and when dad returned he couldn't muster the words. For 8 straight years she layered his brain again and again with thoughts of self-hate. Psychologically it was robbery, damaged property, mind monopoly. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. Enough was enough when he turned 15. No get out of jail free, he fled the scene. Went back to his nan and grabbed to South East. Picked up his first job in Peckham McDee's. One day after work he was walking home, he got jumped, they stole his phone. When he got home he packed his coat and went back out to confront those blokes. Something had broken, something had snapped. From that day forward there was no going back. Always prepared for a defensive attack, no wonder why they said he lacked tact. He started mixing and picked up the mic, spun up a vibe, said what he liked. Some of his so-called friends jumped on the ride and took advantage of the kindness inside. This was a shock to the system, cause once upon a time he had missed them. He defended them when others had dissed them, befriended them when nobody listened. Some stole money, some stole girls, some were bullies, some were melts. Some said things that were clearly never true, some done things they said they'd never do. So he sipped on a whiskey, smoked on a blunt, erasing history and selfish. Then he put a few white lines up his nose, erasing timelines and his soul. In control of being out of control, on a roll, only one way to go. Stuck in a hole, but he didn't know, he thought every hole was a goal. Then came the intervention that he needed, all of the above got back seated. Some days were cold, some days were heated. He never quit, that's why he succeeded. They tried to make him doubt himself, but he'd already survived living through hell. So when they threatened to put him in a cell, he just dug deep and drunk from the well. But that's not the ending, he lost all his friends cause he stopped pretending. He spoke the truth and that was offensive. Ride or die but nobody meant it. Yeah, he was hurt, they dragged his name through the dirt, but he'd had enough of being a cur. So he left the herd and lives his life by his word. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power. Nobody can take my power, that's how I get my power.